Hey all, so we're back with another Spotlight with Context, and this one holds a special place in my heart because this is the fourth character that I have built for Marvel Contest of Champions, and they're pretty meaningful to me. As the Spotlight says here, I want to skip to the note at the bottom. I was able to work on this with my friend Vega, who I've known for literal years, and him starting a YouTube channel and having me around on it was a major reason that I started my own channel, which eventually led me to work at Kabam. And so that collaboration was really meaningful to me. He was not there through like the entire playtesting process, but he was a really important sounding board to me. Um, Early on in the process, we went back and forth, talked about goals, potential abilities, and his reactions to, okay, well, how is that going to work out, just like really helped me out in figuring out my priorities. And I'll talk about one ability later that he did directly inspire, but just huge thanks to Vega for helping me out in this process. Now, one of the reasons that I reached out to Vega was because I knew that he also considered this character very important to him, because I don't normally go over the bios for characters, but representation is important to all of us here at Kabam. Obviously, there's a lot of very justified attention on Chieelth this month because she is a brand new original character built from the ground up with the involvement of a lot of incredibly talented First Nations artists and creators. The champion designer for her is directly from the nation that she is based in fictionally, and that is so cool, right? We had cultural consultants for all of that. Now, I am not Apache. I don't, as far as I know, have any of that blood in me, but I did spend most of my life growing up in a state that once included an awful lot of Apache territory. And so I do think that this representation in this game is an incredibly important thing, and I did my best to do it justice and bring it into this game in a very respectful way. I'm sure I've fallen short in some ways, but I hope you guys enjoy Kushala. One of the things that was very important to both me and Vega as we were discussing this early on was that we were delivering a character that was Apache, that was informed by being a member of the Apache Nation, but was not a caricature of such, right? And so, really going with the story of how Kushala lived through a tragedy at the hands of the United States Army, sought out a spirit of vengeance, and then sought to grow from that to not be defined by the violence, and ultimately became Sorcerer Supreme, was really important to me. So I really wanted to show off the power of that spirit of vengeance and connect her to the other Ghost Riders in our game, but to really link her as kind of growing from that, having more control, more finesse, and feeling a bit like some of the sorcerers that we've had in game, whose kits are more about balancing abilities together at the same time rather than going from hit to hit, if that makes sense. With that preamble, I think we can move on to the base stats and abilities. There's not a whole lot going on with the attack and health here. Health is pretty normal, a little bit higher than some other women characters in the game. Attack is a bit above average, and her prestige is okay, right? I think she's top 20, but like, as with some earlier characters, she's one where if you pull her as a 7-star especially, you'll be rewarded for investing in her, but she's not going to be carrying you into top 5 AQ. Before we get into the champion attributes, though, I do want to point out something that will be clear from her in-game info page that is not anywhere in this spotlight, and that is that she has, just out of the box, 40% energy resistance. This is in line with Purgatory and a couple other characters, but it means that she significantly blunts incoming energy damage, and is a really solid option for just mitigating anything along those lines. This isn't new for Mystic characters, and I pulled the actual potency from Purgatory, who also has that same 40% energy resist. And this won't let you take like Hazard Shift, Shock, Incinerate, right? But it obviously does mitigate quite a bit of damage and is a nice ability to call out. Moving on to our attributes, survivability at 3 is kind of balancing a couple things, right? If you actually get hit with Kushala, as long as it's, not energy damage, you are going to feel it, right? She definitely does. She doesn't really have much in the way of tank stats for actually getting hit. She does have a normal health pool rather than a small one, like we talked about, so she's not uniquely weak there, but she's also not all that strong. That said, she blocks very well. We'll get into that later, but if you get good with her, you can take very, very little block damage, and so that has to be reflected in a decent survivability score. Damage 4.5. This is ultimately somebody who can shoot fire at will, right? And there's a lot of damage in this kit. Ease of use 2.5. This is one that took a while for her balance designer and me to kind of land on, because if you just want the basics with Kushala, you can literally just end your combos in light attacks after parrying and throw specials and get decent results, right? And that was something that I was going for. But if you want to maximize her, she asks you to do some relatively fancy things. And so as a compromise, we arrived at 2.5. Utility of 3. She doesn't have power control, but she has very good buff control and a couple other really strong pieces of utility that will come up here and there. So this is definitely fair. And then Defender Strength 1.5. This honestly might be overselling it. She doesn't really do anything through your block. If you get hit by your specials, you're probably going to die. That is kind of standard Mystic threat, right? But at the same time, as we'll get into later, she approaches Mystic Dispersion differently than any Mystic that comes before her. And while that makes her, in my opinion, very smooth on offense, it does blunt her defensive threat a fair amount. So I would not consider her a dual threat in Battlegrounds. Moving on to strengths and weaknesses, number 1 strength is damage over time. Kushala has a lot of different red numbers. She has Incinerates first and foremost, but she also has Soul Barb, and she's got a little bit of degen in there, and you can kind of use them as necessary. Using anything other than the Incinerates as your primary damage source may slow you down, but you're still going to have weapons, right? She has a ton of damage over time. Power gain I'm listing as a strength, but you'll kind of see how there's some nuances to this when we get to it later, because she doesn't benefit from Mystic Dispersion, which is another way of saying she kind of has her own Mystic Dispersion, where she gains power when buffs begin rather than when they end. Because that is broader and more powerful, the potency comes down, but she still gains a lot of power, and she can do it without just needing to hit the opponent. I also mentioned earlier, she is very good at blocking. She can block unblockables against non-science champions. She also can regen block damage, allowing her to deal with effects like Pierce or Disorient quite well. Moving on to weaknesses, like I said, her red numbers are flexible, but also, like I said, the Incinerate is the best source of damage, and it does require Nullify to access it. And so if you are locked out of either of those, she is going to be significantly slower most of the time. Now, buff immunity is pretty much a hard shutdown. Almost everything in her kit requires buffs to be on the opponent. And so if you end up in a match where your opponent cannot gain buffs at all, she's going to have some tools, but very, very few. And then tempo disruption. Kushala is at her best when she can keep the fight moving and when she can run through her specials and generally be a bit aggressive, right? Anything that stops her from being aggressive, I list here evade, miss, unstoppable, auto block, all of those can really slow her down or even grind her to a halt if they disrupt her loop too badly. That's somewhat standard, but a lot of champions have answers to at least one of those, and I'm calling out that she doesn't. Getting into the abilities themselves, Kushala, like the other two Ghost Riders in the game, is immune to all bleed and incinerate effects. Like many of the sorcerers in-game, she gains 20% less combat power rate, meaning the power from hitting the opponent or being struck, and all of her attacks deal energy damage. So yes, that does mean she's a cord counter. Additionally, because she's a mystic and I want you to throw specials, but also because I want you to feel like you can throw your specials and not worry about things expiring in the middle of those specials, her personal damaging effects are paused during her special attacks. So more power, more specials, more duration on your dots. Moving on to Hunter of Might, this is where we get into her Mystic Dispersion replacement. So her light attacks have a 40% chance to place an indefinite ignition buff on the opponent. The chance increases by 20% flat if the opponent is soul barbed. So you're at 60% then, right? These buffs stack up to 10, but they do not do anything. Their description is literally that these buffs are fuel, right? So they fuel the rest of her abilities. And one of those abilities is this next one. Whenever the opponent gains a buff, Kushala gains 2% of her max power. So this means that she will gain power from buffs that never end, from buffs that are consumed by the opponent, like when Mr. Negative consumes his own buffs by dashing backwards, etc. She doesn't have to nullify buffs off the opponent or wait for them to expire naturally to get power from them. She gets it immediately as soon as the buff happens. Because, like I said, this is broader and potentially more powerful, she gains a lot less power as a result. Like I said, she does not benefit in the traditional way from the Mystic Dispersion Mastery at all. Instead, each rank that you have in MD increases the amount of power she gains by 10%, meaning that that goes up to 50% at 5 out of 5, and then she will gain 3% of her max power instead of 2%. I know this looks like a huge hit, because 5 points in Mystic Dispersion is 12% of max power when a buff expires or is nullified, and this brings it all the way down to 3. But just trust me when I say it's enough. We'll get into that later. Now, the meat and potatoes of her kit, so to speak, is Blessings of the Eagle here. Each of these blessings stacks up to 3 instances. You gain a Blessing of Wisdom whenever either champion performs a well-timed block, allowing her to block unblockable attacks from non-science champions and passively regenerate 25% of the damage taken from blocked hits. Now, obviously, the binary ability to block unblockable attacks does not stack, but the regen does, meaning that if you have 3 Blessings of Wisdom active, you are regenerating 75% of the damage taken from blocked hits. Obviously, that benefits from the Recovery Mastery, taking it up over 80%, and you can get a lot back even against somebody who is pounding through your block like Hulkling. Kushala gains a Blessing of Justice when either champion is struck by the first hit of a heavy attack. I phrase it this way despite the fact that Kushala only has 1 hit in her heavy attack, so that you know it's going to be the first hit of yours if you hit her with a heavy. Blessings of Justice make the opponent more aggressive and increase the potency of Kushala's damaging effects by 10%. So this is kind of like a Vicious, except it also works on passives, which we'll get to. And like it says, it makes the opponent more aggressive. This is the same basic flavor as Infuriate, but each stack is significantly weaker. They add up to roughly the effect of what you would expect from an Infuriate. She gains a Blessing of Power whenever either champion intercepts their opponent. Doesn't matter if she's attacking or defending. That increases her ability power rate by 15% and reduces the opponent's by the same amount. So reducing the opponent's ability power rate by up to 45% is really nice, because if you're fighting somebody like Hulkling, that power he gains from converting buffs can be cut basically in half. This slows somebody like Hyperion way down. This can mitigate Mystic Dispersion a little bit, etc. She's not going to get into full ability power reversal like America Chavez might, but you don't need to keep a debuff on the opponent, you just need to intercept them periodically, so this is a very powerful ability. Additionally, we talked about how at 5 out of 5 Mystic Dispersion, she gains 3% of her max power. Well, if you're boosting that by 45%, you're up to about 4.5% of a bar of power, right? And so now we're really getting somewhere. This is about the same amount of power that you would expect from running 3 points in Mystic Dispersion with somebody else, and she just gets that instantly whenever a buff triggers on the opponent. But again, that is when you have all 3 blessings of power. So blessings are not affected by ability accuracy, you don't have to worry about that part. Each blessing lasts for 12 seconds, and you get an additional 15 seconds flat if these are activated while either champion is performing or recovering from a special attack 1 or 2. Now, what this means is that if Kushala parries the opponent's special 1 or 2, if she punishes their special 1 or 2 with a heavy, or if she intercepts them with her special 1 or 2, any of those count as being during this animation, and so you will get that 15 seconds extra. And there is a call out for it, don't worry, so you will know if it happens. This also happens if her opponent does one of these things to her, but like I said, I don't expect Kushala to be a major defender, so for the most part, if your opponent is parrying your specials, landing a heavy after them, or intercepting you with theirs, something's probably going wrong. When you activate a blessing while both other blessings have more active stacks, pause all blessings for 3 seconds. I mentioned earlier a key theme in her kit is chasing balance. This is what I mean. It's kind of hard to phrase this elegantly, but basically what this means is that you always want to be activating the blessing that has the least current stacks. If 2 blessings are tied for having the least number of stacks, well then trigger one of them and then trigger the other, right? Because the last one that you trigger, will now be the least number of stacks. There will be more blessings of the other types active, and then you'll get the pause. This becomes pretty intuitive once you play with it for a little bit. And then finally, the ability accuracy of Kushala's personal effects and the parry mastery is increased by 35% for each unique blessing active. So she's not going to boost the chance of nodes triggering like Hazard Shift. She doesn't have extra ability accuracy to trigger decks, but she can parry somebody like Adam Warlock, who's reducing the ability accuracy of parry, and she can apply her own effects through something like glancing because she's boosting their ability accuracy in this way. Now, this is for each unique blessing, so it doesn't matter if you've parried 3 times and have 3 blessings of wisdom. You need one of each blessing at least for this to max out at plus 105 ability accuracy, but once you're there, things really start popping off. If we go back to the Hunter of Might section, where light attacks have a 40% chance to place an indefinite ignition buff, if you have 105% extra ability accuracy on that, then that means that you are multiplying that 40% by 2.05, right? 100 plus 105. And so that puts you just above 80%. The 20% flat from the opponent having a soul barb on them is then added after that multiplicative calculation. And so when you have all 3 blessings up and there is a soul barb on your opponent, then your light attacks have just over a 100% chance to place a buff. Moving on to the specials, the special one will feel familiar to a lot of people because it is basically Dr. Voodoo's special one, but with fire instead of poison. This, I have to give a shout out to my teammate Kabam Eclipse, who worked on Danny Moonstar, At one point, he was also working on Kushala, and this was in his notes, and I adored it, and so I kept it. So, like it says, on the final hit, each buff on the opponent has a 50% chance to be nullified. This chance is rolled independently for each individual buff, but it can be boosted by your extra ability accuracy with the blessings, remember? And then for each successful nullification, you inflict an Incinerate debuff doing this much damage over 18 seconds, right? Remember that because this is a personal damaging effect, it benefits from her Blessing of Justice, and it is also paused during her specials. Now, if your opponent is Soul Barbed or Degenerating, as in if they have a Degen or a Soul Barb on them when you throw this, you get an additional 4 Incinerates for free. This does not require Nullify, so you can actually do this against an opponent who is nullifying you. Now, you won't get credit for any of the other buffs they have, but you will get the 4 Incinerates. The Special 2, the final hit, consumes 30% of the ignition buffs on the opponent. This is not a nullify. It just consumes them to fuel her own ability. And she will inflict a Soul Barb debuff for 15 seconds. She can get up to 3 of these, and each one is going to deal a small amount of energy damage to the opponent every second for each buff on them. Now, this doesn't snapshot the number of buffs when it applies. As with Mordo, who also has a Soul Barb, this will update every half second when it deals damage based on the number of buffs on the opponent. This will also update if you throw it and then land a heavy attack to get a Blessing of Justice, so keep looking for those opportunities. Now, this debuff lasts an additional 0.75 seconds for each buff consumed, so you benefit from having ignition buffs on the opponent, and for each Incinerate effect on the opponent. So if you throw this after the Special 1, your Soul Barb will last longer. This feeds into her core loop, because if this Soul Barb lasts longer, it's easier to throw Special 1s during it, meaning that you get extra Incinerates, and if you have extra Incinerates, you can come back to the Special 2 and get even longer Soul Barbs. So just alternating between Special 1 and Special 2 is very often the way to go with her. Sometimes you might want to do 2 Special 1s before you go back to your Special 2, something along those lines, but that's kind of your core damage loop in a vanilla fight. The Special 3 is your traditional long fight ramp special. It also does some damage, but in my mind, the primary function of this is that you gain 1 stack of each blessing, and then you place an indefinite judgment on the opponent. This judgment is going to increase the duration of any future blessings by a flat 4 seconds, and stacks up to 3. So if you've thrown 3 Special 3s in a fight, obviously that's going to take a while, then Kushala's blessings are going to have a duration of 24 seconds, potentially plus another 15 if you get the bonus duration for activating them during special attacks, which means that they can last all the way up to just under 40 seconds, as opposed to their base duration of 12. And then for each active blessing, including the 3 you gain during this attack, you inflict a degen debuff that lasts 8 seconds. And obviously this goes up to a max stacks of 9, because that's how many blessings she has. Now, these degens are not very long, they only last 8 seconds. But after the Special 3, it's important to note that you will always have 3 unique blessings, meaning you have extra ability accuracy and can probably place a lot of ignition buffs on your opponent very quickly, thereby gaining power and getting to your Special 1, which will then pause these degens, getting some extra damage out of them, and because there's a degen on your opponent, giving you extra Incinerates. So following up the Special 3 with a Special 1 can be a really nice way to get some extra damage. Looking at the signature ability, the pause for activating your blessing with the fewest stacks is going to last up to an additional 5 seconds at Sig 200. So that pause being up to 8 seconds can be really meaningful in keeping uptime on all of your abilities. Additionally, Kushala's damaging debuffs have a 9% chance at Sig 200 for each active blessing to be replaced with matching passives with 20% increased potency. This 20% does not scale with SIG level. The passives always do more damage. And then this chance is doubled against cosmic opponents. So some quick math, if you have all 9 blessings active, then that is 9 times 9, and you can have up to an 81% chance against just a generic opponent to land these passives. You're probably not going to be at 9 blessings all that often, though, because once you're there, you can't apply your pause until one of your blessings falls off. So more often, I think you're probably going to be in the 6 to 7 range, meaning that this is about a 54 to 72% chance to apply these passives. Not guaranteed. You're going to lose some if you're facing purifiers, but it is still a significant reward for keeping your blessings up. And then against cosmics, she's really good against cosmics on Mighty Charge, because you, at max sig, you only need a few blessings to get this up to 100%. It's at 100% with 6 blessings, and then you're just landing all of your dots without worrying about them being purified. Very strong part of the SIG. And in my opinion, the biggest reason to take her all the way up to 200. Because remember, getting those passives is automatically a damage boost. So this chance for passives was actually the ability I mentioned that was directly inspired by Vega when we were talking. He made some offhand comment about how all of these damaging debuffs she had would be vulnerable to skill purifiers like Kingpin. And to his credit, immediately walked back to the objection, because he's like, no, that's too much. We can't have her like nuking all of the skill champions. And he's right. Like, for these to just be passives would be insane. That's the kind of thing that basically needs to live in Mutant, right? But at the same time, there are nodes like Mighty Charger right back at it that you can place somebody like Adam Warlock on, who was an explicit target of her Soul Barb. And so if that only exists as a debuff, then it might not actually counter him, depending on node placement. And so I then became motivated to try and find a balanced way to deliver these as passives. That's why the chance is so much higher against Cosmics, because if you use her against somebody like Kingpin, you probably will lose an awful lot of your ramp up, and she's not going to be as fast as a mutant like Toad or something, right? But it means that against those skill champions, you have a chance, even though she won't be ideal, and it means that she can follow these cosmic defenders even onto nodes that deal with debuffs and still hunt them there, which I thought fit the whole Hunter of Might thing that she already had going on. So I think we arrived at a balanced version of it, but it's definitely a strong ability. Now, this last bullet doesn't scale with Sig level, but we're going to have to spend some time on it because it's weird. Once you awaken her and unlock the possibility of those passive debuffs, Kushala turns off the Despair Mastery. Instead, she replaces it with a version that's stronger, that scales off of debuffs and her own personal passives. So the same way Despair can reduce healing by up to 15% per debuff on the opponent, Kushala is looking for those debuffs and her own passive incinerates, soul barbs, or degens. So it is a strict upgrade. At no points in Despair, this is 8% for each debuff on the opponent, and it goes up to a maximum reduction of 100%. That would require you to have 13 debuffs or passives on the opponent to fully shut down their healing there, but that does happen sometimes. Of course, if your opponent's running Recovery, this is the same problem that normal Despair runs into. They will still be healing a little bit because their regen rate will actually be 115%, which is then only reduced by 100 to 15%. But if you're running points in Despair, then that reduction per effect goes up by 4% per rank, and the maximum reduction goes up by 10% per rank, meaning that at 3 out of 3 points in Despair, she reduces regen rate by 20% per effect on the opponent, and it goes up to a maximum of 130% reduction. Meaning that if you get up to 7 effects on the opponent, which is not that difficult with all of the dots her specials apply, you can reduce regen rate by 130%, meaning that even if you're facing somebody with the recovery mastery maxed, you'll be reversing their healing by 15%. That's not a huge heal reversal. She's not going to be competing with, Void or Mr. Fantastic, but it's more red numbers that you can eke out of her if you play her right. So really cool ability there. Like I said, straight upgrade over the Despair Mastery. Getting into her synergies, she of course has one with Dani Moonstar and Sheilth. Dani gets a combo shield passive for 5 seconds the first time each fight that she would be struck. And then Sheilth has a 100% chance to block unblockable special attacks while she has 8 or more personal cleanse passives. Kushala's Blessings of Power reduce the opponent's ability power rate by an additional 10% each. That is a flat increase, hence the little minus sign in front of the 10, meaning that you can get up to a 75% reduction at 3 Blessings of Power. Fire cleanses with Longshot, Phoenix, Massacre, and Sunspot. Everybody other than Kushala gets 15% stronger incinerates. This is obviously nuts for a few of these champions, especially Longshot and Massacre. Kushala gets a variant of Sunspot's ability that just adds damage to his hits based on flare state. For each damaging effect on the opponent, Kushala's heavy attack deals extra damage equal to 5% of her base attack. So this isn't going to scale with Furies or anything like that. It is just a flat increase to the number, whether white, orange, or yellow, based on how many damaging effects are on the opponent. This also means that it does get around weakness, if that is potentially a factor here. I don't think it's going to be the most powerful synergy, but I am curious to see what people do with it. Now moving on to these next two, Shadows on the Road Ahead and Shadows on the Road Behind. It is a song reference, if you were thinking it, but obviously one of these is for sorcerers, one of these is for Ghost Rider, trying to reference her journey from one to the other to some extent. For the sorcerers, all of them, including Kushala, get a Amplify passive when they activate a special 3, just increasing ability power rate further, allowing them to cycle more specials, good for all of these. For the Ghost Riders, damaging effects gain 10% increased potency. Yes, that is not insane for Cosmic Ghost Rider. I know what I did. You know what I did. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. But it does help him. It is pretty darn good for OG Ghost Rider, and it is quite good for Kushala. For recommended masteries and relics, obviously she has dedicated interactions with Mystic Dispersion and Despair that upgrade with points spent in them, so of course I'm going to tell you to put points in those. And then she works quite well with both the Scarlet Witch relic and the Ghost Rider relic. To some extent she was built for the Scarlet Witch relic. Her blessings count as blessings for that relic and trigger its abilities, so you can stack either amplifies or rejuvenates pretty easily. She can actually just barely go net positive on healing block damage if you really dig into the rejuvenate rune, which I love. She can also get a frankly scary amount of power if you invest in the amplify instead. And it can further boost her ability accuracy during specials if for some reason you need that. The Ghost Rider relic, on the other hand, works nicely with the degen on her special 3. Should you find yourself using that, you'll get the degen vulnerability and the stagger off of it. But this relic also just boosts damaging effects and power gain, which is generically good for Kushala. So either of those are great. And that's pretty much it. I hope you guys are excited about this. I definitely am. I'm really happy with how she came together. I was intimidated by the prospect of having to synthesize Ghost Rider and Sorcerer, agonized over it a bit, and honestly, some of the first drafts weren't great at that. Really took me a while to get to a balance I was happy with, and thanks again to Vega for helping me talk through that, and to my team for helping me talk through that and really pushing me to try and make sure that both Ghost Rider and Sorcerer were represented in this kit. But I'm really excited for her. I think that regenning on block damage and extra ability accuracy are two of my favorite things about Sorcerer Supreme, an old champion that I am fond of. I've always liked Dr. Voodoo, and it's cool to see the Special One come back in some way. And obviously, a lot of the community has been expecting a Mystic with Soul Barb in some way or another ever since Adam Warlock dropped and called that out. And she just melts gore. It's pretty funny. Hope y'all are looking forward to her. I'm really curious to see what you think in the comments. But until next time, thank you so much for watching, and take care.